Hi, welcome to today's HST 3103 lecture, and today we'll be talking about the New Deal and the arts and New Deal era government arts programs. So during the Great Depression and the early years of World War II, the federal government engaged in an unprecedented support of the arts under the umbrella of various New Deal programs. These programs, administered by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and other government agencies, were aimed at both providing work for unemployed artists, as well as promoting art and culture in a nation ravaged by economic uncertainties and hardships. President Roosevelt is said to have declared, quote, 100 years from now, my administration will be known for its art, not for its relief. So just a little bit of background and reminder. We don't talk too much about the New Deal and sort of the political and economic side of the 1930s in this class. This is more of a cultural history class. But just a little bit of a refresher on some of the major goals of these New Deal programs. And remember, the New Deal is kind of the umbrella term that's used to describe the various policies and programs that the Roosevelt administration put into place to address the Great Depression, and it's kind of this set of policies that vastly expanded the role of the federal government in the economy. So one of the most important goals was economic recovery. So this included things like stabilizing the banking system, stabilizing prices for industry and agriculture, aiding sort of bankrupt state and local governments, really about injecting large amounts of federal spending into the economy to help bolster aggregate incomes and demand. A second major goal of the New Deal was job creation, and this connects, sort of directly to New Deal programs, or to New Deal arts programs. So remember, at its height, unemployment in 1933 was 25%. But, throughout the entire Great Depression, unemployment is still pretty high, in the low 20s. The New Deal programs created a multitude of agencies to provide jobs for millions of workers and paid wages that saved millions of destitute families. A third goal, a major goal of the New Deal, is the investment in public works. So the New Deal built hundreds of thousands of highways, bridges, hospitals, schools, theaters, libraries, city halls, post offices, parks, and community centers across the country. And this really connects to the second goal as well, job creation, that, there's all of these federal agencies that are employing people to help build these public works projects like roads, and also art. A fourth goal, major goal of New Deal programs was civic uplift, and this is also where art connects directly. Improving the lives of people in cities and towns and communities physically and psychologically. So creating a sense of pride and hope in communities as the nation as a whole as we're going through these difficult times. So one thing that we'll really talk about in class, obviously we'll think about how these programs created jobs and, created like these public works projects, right? Is art a public work? But we'll also think about how New Deal arts programs helped achieve civic uplift and helped give people sort of hope and a sense of pride in their communities. And is this wholly a positive thing, the way they went about doing it? So that's one thing that we'll talk about. So just a little overview now of some of the major programs, New Deal arts programs that were administered under the New Deal, and you will be seeing some examples of art created under those programs too. So the Public Works of Art Project, which ran from 1933 to 1934, is the first major federal project for artists, and it's managed by the Treasury Department. This is kind of like a pilot program for later New Deal arts programs, and it's really put into effect kind of in the first year or two of FDR's administration. The Public Works of Art Project, or PWAP, as you'll often see it abbreviated, employed over 3,700 professional artists nationwide and created over 15,000 works of art. Artists were selected based on their need for employment, so you had to sort of be in need of a job, and that's how a lot of these public works programs work, not just for art, but also for like construction jobs with the federal government. But also the Public Works of Art project didn't just look at your need, they looked at your artistic ability. About 30% of artists employed in this sort of pilot project, this PWAP project, were in their 20s. They're just getting started in their careers. I mean, you can imagine what something like a gigantic economic depression does for, people in their 20s just starting out their artistic careers. There's not a huge demand for that kind of work anymore. 25% of artists who worked for this kind of pilot New Deal arts program, the PWAP, were first-generation immigrants. And the purpose of the PWAP was to, quote, give work to artists by arranging to have competent representatives of the profession embellish public buildings. So it was really about embellishing government buildings. So a lot of murals and sculptures for government buildings. So providing employment for artists, but also creating art for federal building spaces. So murals and sculptures created by the Public Works of Art program were placed in public buildings, including the White House and Congress, and actually one at Kansas State University too. And the success of this project spawned other New Deal arts initiatives because this kind of PWAP, this pilot project was so successful. Then you get some of the larger New Deal arts projects that we'll be talking about in a second. One of the most famous examples of a PWAP mural project is the murals in Coit Tower that were created in 1933 in San Francisco. Many of the artists were teachers and students at the California School of the Fine Arts. And most of the artists were committed to sort of racial equality and leftist and even Marxist political ideas. And so we'll take a look at those murals in class and think about, how their politics is visible in their artwork. And these murals are still in existence in Coit Tower. You can go see them in person. So a lot of the New Deal arts and culture programs were run under the umbrella of a larger New Deal agency called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was a large New Deal organization that was created in 1935 and lasted until 1943. And the overall WPA spent $12 billion and gave jobs to 9 million people, although about 3/4 of this money is going to construction projects. So, the WPA is building dams and bridges and roads and all of these kinds of infrastructure projects. That's really what they're known for, and that's the majority of their work. But the WPA takes a broad view of the idea of worker, with special programs devised for writers, musicians, actors, and artists. I should actually note when I said that the WPA spent $12 billion over its lifetime, that's in, 1930s money. So you have to sort of times that by maybe 18, 19, 20 to get 2021 dollars. So 12 billion times 20, right? That's kind of what the budget was. So, when President Roosevelt was kind of criticized for including people like artists and writers and musicians into the WPA recovery effort, his kind of wisecracking response was, why not? They're human beings too. They have to live. Right? And that's actually something we'll be talking about as well, the idea of the artist as worker. So the WPA, which is this giant public works program, and a lot of it is doing like infrastructure project, but again, under its umbrella, it has a lot of these arts programs. And it administered the 4 main programs in the arts. And $27 million, that's not a lot out of the larger budget, but it's still a lot for the artists, right? And times that by about 20, right, for today's dollars. 27 million was dispersed to the sort of arts and culture projects under the WPA over its eight-year history. That's about, $450 million in today's money. So that's a lot of money for the arts. So one of the projects was the Federal Theater Project, which put actors, directors, playwrights, musicians, dancers, vaudevillians, box office staff, ushers, designers, and other theater workers on the relief roles to produce performances relevant to local and regional areas. New York had by far the largest project under the Federal Theater Project, with units for classical theater, new plays, children's plays, puppet shows, caravan productions, and a lot of these productions would then kind of tour through smaller towns and rural areas. The Federal Theater Project nationally employed about 12,700 people, and the Federal Theater Project actually also included African American, Yiddish, Italian, Spanish, French, and German units, especially for like Yiddish, Italian, Spanish, French, and German, right? These are trying to appeal to immigrant communities. So these goals of sort of civic uplift and making the arts accessible are, in multiple languages. And the African American theater unit, which was active in New York, actually famously put it was actually called at the time the Negro Theater Unit, using the parlance at the time, put together a very well-regarded and popular run of Macbeth, often referred to as colloquially Voodoo Macbeth because it was set in Haiti. And we'll be watching sort of a clip in class about some of the New Deal arts programs, and it shows a clip from that so we can talk about it then. Approximately 5,000 play scripts and documentation related to about 2,500 of these titles are in the Library of Congress, with 13,000 online images of stage and costume designs, still photos, posters, and more. So there's a lot of material that still exists if you're interested in this about the Federal Theater Project. The project was actually shut down earlier than the other New Deal arts and culture projects in 1939 by Congress because too many of the productions ran into political problems as they were seen as too radical and too left-wing in their themes. And so the project was shut down after only 4 years. The Federal Writers Project, which ran sort of the whole length of the New Deal, 1935 to 1943, employed 6,600 writers and editors across the country. Most of these jobs were based on economic need. In other words, you had to be unemployed or you needed a job, although some of the sort of management or editor jobs were based on skill only. So the Federal Writers Project did things like index newspapers, compiled local histories, gathered oral histories and ethnographies. There's two major projects that I want to point out that are still really interesting today. The first is the American Guide series. So every state level Federal Writers Project, and a lot of these projects you had the national office, then you kind of had state offices. Every state level Federal Writers Project produced a comprehensive travel guide to that state. And at the time, there were 48 states. Plus, there was also one to the Alaska Territory, which was a territory at the time, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. So there were 51 guides that were produced. And this is a travel guide, but it's a giant, thick book. It's a set of historical, cultural, social, and economic guides as well. So it really gives you an overview of sort of the history and the economy, and also sort of how people in the 30s were looking at sort of their state and why it's a place that you should come and visit. But they're fascinating guides. There's actually a lot of folklore that was collected in them. And Federal Writers Project writers have actually gone to the archives, some of the archives for the Kansas Federal Writers Project, which is a state university. And you can see some of the drafts of different articles of theirs, and even ones that didn't make it into the guide. And these individuals, I mean, this is the Kansas example, but this happened in every state, would go to like every little community and get sort of that community's history and talk about any kind of interesting landmarks or historical sites or cultural markers, and talk about like the different ethnic communities, and create kind of these fascinating guides of the history and the community and the culture of that state. I mean, obviously, this was written in the 1930s, early 40s. There's a lot of, bias and racism and sexism, but they're very fascinating and still immensely readable today. A second very important project produced by the Federal Writers Project, which a lot of people in history still look at today, is the Slave Narratives Project. So the Federal Writers Project recorded 2,300 first-person oral history accounts of slavery. So employees of the Federal Writers Project found individuals who were still alive in the 1930s who had been enslaved. So African Americans who were alive during the legality of slavery and themselves lived as enslaved persons, and did oral history interviews with them. And these 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery were donated to the Library of Congress, and in 1941 assembled as 17-volume Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States. And the Library of Congress has digitized a lot of this, so it's a fascinating resource. There's actually a number of accounts from Kansas and Missouri, so of people who were living in Kansas and Missouri. I mean, remember, Missouri was a slave state. And the individuals in Kansas most of them had been enslaved in other states and were living in Kansas when they were recorded. Another major project of kind of these WPA arts and culture programs is the Federal Music Project, which employed musicians, conductors, and composers during the Great Depression. And this project sponsored the performance of thousands of concerts. It funded music classes for adults and children. It hosted music festivals and created 35 new orchestras across the country for public enjoyment and the appreciation of music. Actually, Kansas City, Kansas had 2 Federal Music Project orchestras, one black and one white. And there's a lot of interesting archival material and photographs on sort of their performances that the Kansas State Historical Society and actually the National Archives have. The Federal Music Project also conducted research on American traditional music and folk songs, a practice now that we would call ethnomusicology. So this is kind of one of the first major notable attempts to sort of collect and document traditional American music of various groups and subregions. And the Federal Music Project created notable sort of studies on cowboy music, so like traditional cowboy, on Creole music, and also traditional African American music as well, and sort of created a record of kind of these traditional music and folk songs that you can still access and listen to today. So probably the most well-known New Deal arts program, and one of these programs that was sort of administered by the WPA, was the Federal Arts Project. The Federal Arts Project was for the visual arts, and it's the largest of the New Deal arts projects. It employed, between 1935 and 1943, more than 10,000 artists and craft workers who produced maybe even more, but an estimate maybe 225,000 works of art. So again, the main goal is to provide jobs for unemployed artists. This is a relief program. And, 80 to 90% of the artists came from the relief roles. In other words, they had to demonstrate that you were unemployed or underemployed. It's typically maybe like the supervisors or the people that are overseeing large mural projects who are maybe more qualified or have more experience and don't come from the relief roles. But really, this is a jobs program. In the same way that, the building roads and bridges and dams was a jobs program. So there were a number of divisions within the Federal Art Project. And one of them was creating art, right? So creating murals, which is what we often think of this art, but also easel painting, sculpture, graphic art, posters, photography, theater scene design, and arts and crafts. Many were created for display in public buildings or loaned out to nonprofits and other community institutions. It's really interesting. So the current government agency, the GSA, the General Services Administration, technically has or does have administrative power over all of this art. So all of the art that was created by New Deal arts programs is still technically federal government property. Although during kind of the 30s and 40s, a lot of it was kind of long-term loaned out to institutions. And then over the years, some of it has kind of disappeared or been sold on the market. So the GSA has been trying to recover a lot of this artwork in like the past decade. They've acquired about 23,000 pieces throughout this century, throughout kind of the past 10 to 20 years. But that's maybe like 10% of what was created. So creating art, obviously, is a big aspect of the Federal Art Project. But another aspect is providing art classes and instruction to people across the country. So sometimes maybe if you're employed by the Federal Art Project, you'd work on a mural or an easel painting, but then maybe you'd also provide art instruction at a local community center. And also, there were more than 100 community art centers that were established by the Federal Art Project around the country. So this were places for art classes and studio spaces for artists. So if there was a community art center created by the Federal Art Project in your area, then if you were employed by the Federal Art Project, you would maybe have studio space there, you would maybe teach classes there. It really became an art center. And some of them are still in existence today, or sort of became the foundation for larger community art centers that still exist. So this is really not just about, it's about employing artists, but it's also about getting art into the everyday lives of members of the communities through things like public art, but also through people taking art classes. A notable, some of the notable federal arts projects. So the Federal Art Project, some of their notable kind of sub-projects include the Index of American Design, which employed hundreds of artists who made watercolor illustrations of American decorative art objects, so historical decorative art objects. So things like quilts and textiles and handicrafts, like arts and crafts. So they would make watercolor illustrations of American decorative art objects in museums and private collection. And the Index of American Design amassed these thousands of drawings and sort of published a compendium, all of them. So it becomes sort of a history of American design up until the 30s. And this is really kind of part of a larger search for a distinctive American art and a distinctive American identity through art. And it's connected to a growing interest in the 1930s in American folk art and in American arts and crafts of earlier eras. And the National Gallery of Art still has 18,000 of these watercolored renderings of traditional arts and crafts that were sort of part of the Index of American Design, and you can browse them online. It's very interesting. So, kind of a final Federal Art Project sub-program that I wanted to highlight, and I think this is something that a lot of us associate with the Federal Art Project, so we'll talk about it more in class, are posters. This is really what we remember visually today, that the Federal Art Project had kind of a graphic design and printmaking section. Not every state had this, but some of the larger states like New York or California or Illinois. And a lot of the graphic design and printmaking was used to advertise and promote all New Deal programs, not just the arts programs, but all of the New Deal programs. So this was kind of like the commercial art and advertisement in-house sector for the entire federal government. And it really kind of became, if the New Deal arts programs are known to be innovative in any way, it's really through kind of the graphic design and printmaking programs, and that you see a lot of sort of innovation in terms of design and in terms of materials use that take place during the New Deal. And a lot of kind of the 20th century American printmaking tradition is connected to these New Deal programs. We'll talk some more about these posters in class. But one thing we want to think about is, why do the posters continue to hold our interest so much even today? Okay, so a final New Deal arts program, which is not connected to the WPA. It's actually kind of a separate program. It's called the Section of Painting and Sculpture, often referred to as the section, because if you're a New Deal program, you have to have some kind of acronym. So a lot of times you'll hear people talking about WPA art, and especially WPA murals. And the Federal Art Project, which was underneath the WPA, did create a lot of murals. But most of the murals that you see in post offices and other federal buildings across the country actually were created by the section. So the section was established to commission murals and sculptures for federal buildings, newly built. So new federal buildings that were being built by the federal government. It was kind of the art that would go in them. And most of these are post offices. So the section created around 1,200 murals and 30 sculptures that were placed in more than 1,300 cities, and most of these would be post offices. So, this is everything from every major city to like a tiny, teeny little town who was getting a new post office and would get a mural. So unlike other New Deal arts projects, this is how the section is different. There was no requirement that you had to be unemployed or in economic need. This is purely a project, or projects were awarded purely through competition, and funds were distributed as a lump sum and not an hourly wage like the other programs. And all artists could compete regardless of economic status. So unlike other New Deal arts programs, providing jobs and poverty relief is not a big objective, right? This is really about creating a specific kind of public art for government buildings. And because there weren't any requirements of sort of being impoverished or needing of economic need, you actually get a number of, relatively well-known, especially well-known and sort of well-established regional artists who apply to these competitions. And they were almost always judged anonymously, but who would then win. And so, there's some spaces in the United States that have murals that were section murals in post offices that were actually done by relatively notable artists at the time. 1% of new federal building construction funds during the New Deal projects were set aside for, quote, embellishment. In other words, art for the building. And artists are encouraged for these section murals and sculptures to connect to local interests and local history of the site, to consider the specific community your patron and not the federal government. And, it's the Great Depression. This is about civic uplift. So, don't display hardship or tough social realities of the present time, but scenes of uplift and community spirit. Some of these murals haven't done so well over time. Some of them have been lost. Not many have been lost, but, some are kind of showing their wear and tear. But a lot of them have been restored, and many are still on public display, and you can go to hundreds of post offices across the country, in the Midwest, within a couple hours of Kansas City, and see these. And we'll be talking about some of these examples of some of these in class. So I mentioned, that especially for the section murals and post offices, that artists were asked to, connect to local history, connect to the community, provide kind of hope and uplift. And this actually ties into a larger style or movement that was going on that the New Deal arts really connected to, but this was definitely beyond the New Deal, called American Scene. So the American Scene movement is, we can say, a naturalist style of painting and other art forms that was popular roughly during the first half of the 20th century in the United States. It's not really an organized art movement, but it's more of a trend in American art. Its height is really kind of the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And American Scene art depicted scenes of, quote, typical American life, average people in American landscapes. It's kind of this attempt at realism, but a lot of times it sort of bleeds into nationalism and romanticizing. So American Scene really at its core is about the rejection of what were seen as European trends in art. If you know a little bit about art history in America, you'll have heard in 1913 of the Armory Show in New York, which was the first major exposure of Americans to experimental European styles of art like abstraction and cubism. Styles that were seen as very avant-garde. And, there's actually lots of negative reactions among Americans to the Armory Show and this style of art. I mean, within the New York art world, that's one thing, but to the average kind of American consumer across the country, it's like, what is all this European craziness? So American Scene art is partly a reaction against these sort of avant-garde European art forms and trying to find a uniquely American style of art separate from European trends. Although ironically, almost all artists at this time were trained in European traditions. However, when the Great Depression comes about, most artists in the United States really couldn't even afford to go to Europe to study, as kind of was the traditional path for American artists before then. I mean, if you were an artist in the Midwest, you couldn't afford to go to Paris. You couldn't even afford to go to New York City and study, maybe. So the American scene movement is usually divided into two groups: regionalism and social realism. Regionalism really tends to focus on scenes of kind of rural and small town American life, the American farmer, small town inhabitants, right? The people that live in what we call like flyover country. And there's a lot of emphasis on like individual dignity, local identity, kind of heroism of these kinds of figures of rural life. So, somewhat regionalism has a rejection of urban life and technological change that was coming in the early 20th century. There's a lot of sort of questioning: is this realistic or romanticizing? Is it progressive or conservative? And that's something we can talk about in class. The three main figures of regionalism are Thomas Hart Benton, of course, famously from Missouri with his house here in Kansas City, Grant Wood from Iowa, and John Stuart Curry, who was originally from Kansas, although did not spend most of his career there. And this really becomes kind of a big influence on the visual style of popular culture. So you really see like a lot of regionalism in Norman Rockwell, for example. A second kind of subdivision of American scene is social realism, which focus more on urban scenes and city life. So realistic depictions of industrial workers, urban conditions, class divide. It's a lot more overtly political in content typically than regionalism, often highlighting kind of social problems, like city slums, for example, connected to life in modern cities. But both regionalism and social realism, so all of American scene painting and other artworks, are really about struggles over American identity. And it's interesting, artists working for New Deal programs were often told that their subject matter and style had to relate to, quote, the American scene. So, a lot of this art is about local and regional subjects, be that sort of in the countryside or in the city. And a lot also tries to construct an image of the country as striving to survive in hard times through hard work and determination. It can easily sort of become romanticized. Some of it, especially social realism, can be kind of critical, but it's really kind of about this, realistically depicting what America is. And we can kind of talk about in class what that means, what the effect of that is, especially during a time like the Great Depression. So New Deal art, and a lot of art kind of in this American scene style more broadly, is often called democratic art. So in class, we'll talk about democratic art. What does this mean? Holger Cahill, who is the director of the Federal Art Project, once stated, quote, "We have subordinated art to our desire to pile up personal possessions, to our interest in conspicuous display and conspicuous waste. We have subordinated art to our consuming passion for commercial success, to our materialistic will to power. We have subordinated art to our love of rivalry, our passion to outdo others in a competitive activity, and we have subjected it further to the whims of social snobbery, the erratic interests of dilettantism, to arbitrary judgments and irresponsible criticism. And in doing so, we have helped to push art from its honorable place as a vital necessity of everyday life and have made it a luxury product intended for the casual enjoyment of jaded wealth." Right? So at its core, there's this idea that art should be a part of the everyday life of everyday people. And, Cahill's saying it hasn't been this way. We've kind of pushed it away. And so a lot of the New Deal arts programs, besides creating jobs, were about how do we kind of recenter art in American life and everyday life? How do we make it democratic? How do we make it something that's accessible to everybody and representative of everyone? Now, that's a lofty goal. we can ask, how good is the New Deal arts programs at doing this? Who and what is being portrayed in this work? Farmers, factory workers, working class, sometimes even people of color, although gender images tend to be pretty traditional. But is everyone, kind of equally being represented? There's a lot of problematic representations of Native Americans in this art. So, who is the we, that is the, quote, common person that the art is supposed to speak to? Also, we can think about, this idea that it should be accessible to the average person, which meant like rendered in a realistic style, and this notion then that somehow there's this contrast with more avant-garde art, with more sort of abstract art, with more sort of difficult art that requires more interpretation. I don't know. I mean, is that kind of paternalistic too, to say that the average person, is that sort of realism is more accessible? It also meant that some of the New Deal programs tended to produce art that now we kind of see as kitschy or lower quality. But, maybe this is just kind of a stereotype and an assumption about art and how it's made and who it's made for. Some of the New Deal arts programs, most specifically the section murals and post offices, actually had a lot of community involvement. Ed Rowan, who was an administrator of the section arts programs, would tell artists, give the people what they want. But one thing when we look at some of the post office murals in class is, well, who are the people? Whose voices in the community are heard and whose are silenced? Right? Can you really, and is there really one thing that, quote, the people want? Or is it just sort of become what the middle classes want, or the white people want, or kind of the privileged want? And maybe not the privileged in the sense of the rich people, right? But maybe the privileged in the sense of kind of who the, quote, common person was seen as. It's interesting in terms of who can be an artist and who can represent a community. The New Deal arts programs actually gave opportunities to a broad sort of swath of artists at a time when there weren't a lot of opportunities. So, we can think of it also being democratic in terms of who gets to be an artist. And for the time, there were actually a lot of women. I think like 20% of all artists in New Deal arts programs were women. For at the time was pretty astounding, especially considering a lot of traditional paths to being an artist, like art school, weren't open to women. There were certainly African Americans and Native Americans who participated in these programs. So, we can think also about democratic as being opportunities for being an artist open. So we'll talk more about this idea of democratic art in class, but just a few concluding comments and kind of a final assessment of the impact of New Deal arts programs on American art. So the style of New Deal art, as we were just talking about, is kind of this American scene, that most of this artwork fits into kind of regionalism or social realism, or, which are both part of American scenes. So the subjects selected for New Deal artworks were often place-based, frequently depicting like historical events in kind of a romanticized way, or representing kind of some hopeful aspect of modern life. And, a lot of times some social realism didn't, but, they tended to avoid pointed depictions of the hardships and grittiness of the Great Depression, right? So, one of the things that we can think about is, is this kind of a romanticization or a whitewashing, literally and figuratively? Or is this, the same as some of the other aspects of 1930s culture, that it's about sort of hope, escape, maybe a little bit of escapism, but about hope. I talked a little bit about that there's some critiques of the quality of art, that much is seen as middling quality later year by historians, but I think a lot of that is because the next major movement that happens artistically in America is abstract expressionism after World War II, which is kind of like, in a lot of ways, seen as kind of the pinnacle of American art. So, do we look down? Do we assess New Deal art created by New Deal projects so much now because it immediately precedes abstract expressionism, which is very different. Although, ironically, a lot of the big figures of abstract expressionism actually sort of cut their teeth as young artists in New Deal arts programs and sort of, learned early on, in their careers, they were, assisting murals and that sort of thing. Very different stylistically, but at least it gave them some experience. A big issue I want to talk about, which is really about kind of assessing the impact of these programs, is the idea of artists as workers. Are artists just like other workers? Is their work different somehow? How has American society perceived artists vis-a-vis other occupations? Is art a vocation, a calling, or both? So really, the conception of the artist is beginning to change in the 1930s as New Deal programs were created for many were created for unemployed artists eligible for government relief. So artists, newly defined by their government as workers, right, produced this unprecedented number of artworks and literary works and theatrical performances, launching careers for many who would become famous in later years. So, we want to think about this kind of radical notion that artists are workers just like any other kind of worker, worthy of government support in just the same way as other occupational groups. And that's kind of a different idea of thinking about artists. A final thing that kind of comes about from New Deal arts programs in America is the idea of the importance of public art and government funding of the arts. As I said, a lot of sort of new buildings, like the post offices, federal buildings that were being built during the New Deal, would have 1% of their budget set aside for, quote, embellishments. And, you see that today. It's kind of a common practice of local, city, regional, state governments. You set 1% aside of a construction project budget for art. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how we see that in our own local community, right? There's the new giant new airport in Kansas City that's going up, and they have a big call out for for art, for public art, and a certain percentage of the budget was set aside just for that. So that kind of tradition of public art and government patronage of the arts and putting aside a portion of the budget for the arts, a lot of that goes back to the New Deal, which is great. So that's positive. Now, on the other side, in terms of patronage, government patronage, it freed a lot of artists from the constraints of private patronage, which was a system that went back hundreds of years. But does government-sponsored work have its own constraints? I mean, think of the constraints of saying you have to paint the style of American scene, right? We can talk, finally, I think, would any New Deal art be considered propaganda? What's the line between government funding art and government creating art as propaganda, right? So ultimately, if the goal of these New Deal arts programs is to create sort of community uplift and hope and sort of civic uplift for communities that were going through this period of hardship, isn't that also, in a way, creating a positive attitude towards the government and its programs? And is that propaganda? And should artists play a role in that, even if they're getting a paycheck in a hard time? So these are all tough questions, and we will all talk about them in class. See you guys for our live class.